There is just one story this morning, the dramatic end of the Gorbachev era in the Soviet Union.
She was one of Britain's most high-profile television presenters, at the pinnacle of her career, when she was mercilessly gunned down outside her house in London. Her killer left the scene without a trace. The cold-blooded murder of Jill Dando sent shockwaves through the country. A nation grieved for the golden girl of TV. This was no ordinary crime. This was a crime that shook Britain. On the 26th of April, 1999, BBC television presenter Jill Dando was shot by a single bullet to her head on the doorstep of her home in southwest London. The hunt for the murderer and his motive proved to be one of the largest, most difficult and expensive inquiries ever conducted by the Metropolitan Police. 2 years later, during a controversial court case, local resident Barry George was found guilty for the killing. But during a dramatic retrial, he was cleared of Jill Dando's murder. So who shot one of Britain's most best-loved television personalities? This is the story of the brutal slaying of Jill Dando, told from the inside through the eyewitness accounts from those closest to the story. Born in Weston-super-Mare, Jill Dando began her journalism career as a reporter on a local paper, the Western Mercury. Determined to work in broadcasting, she eventually went on to become a presenter for BBC South West. She quickly rose to become a household name when she moved to the BBC's national news operation in London, presenting the breakfast news and 6 o'clock news. But she was best known as the face of the hit shows Holiday and Crimewatch, a series which explored unsolved criminal investigations. Above all, Jill Dando was renowned for her down-to-earth charm that endeared her to millions of viewers.
It didn't matter whether she was doing Crimewatch or the news or the holiday programme and the other things she did. She had a warmth and sincerity about her, which is not really something you can learn. It's just the way you are. And I think Jill had that connection with the public that made them feel like she was their sister or their auntie and part of their family.
Jill Dando was a national figure. She was a very pleasant personality, very easygoing. Funnily enough, she self-deprecatingly once described herself as Miss Blando because she thought she was too nice to be true, but she was. People liked her.
When she moved to Fulham, she lived in the next road to where I live. And we would always bump into each other in the local shops, in the street, and that's how we would chat and catch up.
She was great fun, had a fabulous sense of humour, but very serious and professional when she needed to be, and she was just a great person to be around. Throughout certainly my years on Crimewatch, it was always a very close-knit team, and Jill fitted into that perfectly.
It was another young woman who was going to be the face of Britain at the millennium. So she was the embodiment, in a sense, of the BBC.
As well as enjoying a successful TV career, Jill had recently announced her engagement to gynecologist Dr. Alan Farthing.
She was getting married, she was talking about Alan and the wedding and getting excited about organising everything, and she had so much to look forward to, so much fun, happiness in her life.
I remember bumping into her when she came back from Sydney, when she'd been on holiday, and she was totally in love.
They had met on a blind date and were due to be married in September 1999. Jill talked eagerly about her desire to become a mother. She was happier than she had ever been. Jill Dando had spent the night at Alan Farthing's home in Chiswick.
night this evening?
Jill left her fiancé's house in Chiswick. I think it was about 7 or 8 in the morning. The plan was that she would go from the house to, I think she had a fashion shoot at lunchtime, a job she was doing, and then in the afternoon she was planning to go to a fitting for her wedding dress.
Miss Dando had been going to her house purely to get changed. She was no longer living there. She was living with a boyfriend several miles away.
Gowan Avenue was a 2-storey terraced house, which she was actually selling for about $400,000 at the time.
Jill lived on Gowan Avenue in Fulham, southwest London.
Gowan Avenue is almost a typical inner London suburban street. Terraced houses, most of the people are at work during the day and not too many people around at this time.
But it is an area with a lot of families with children out on the street walking, taking children to the park, taking them to and from school or shopping.
When she bought her home in Fulham, was so thrilled about it. She told me that one of the reasons she'd chosen that home was that it had a hedge and it had a tree that afforded her privacy.
Having left her fiancé's home in Chiswick, Jill made various stops on her way home, including a brief visit to the petrol station, King's Mall shopping centre in Hammersmith, and a fishmonger's on Fulham Road, before making her way home. It was around 11:30 a.m. when Jill finally arrived at Gowan Avenue.
She got out of her car, having parked it, and in fact still had the keys to the car in her hand.
As Jill was about to approach her front door, she was unaware that somebody was closely watching her every movement. The BBC's golden girl Jill Dando was the TV star everybody loved. She was full of excitement at her future plans to marry fiancé Dr. Alan Farthing and start a family. But these plans would never bear fruit. Jill arrived at her home on Gowan Avenue at around 11:30 a.m. As she looked for her house keys in her bag, she was approached from behind.
That morning I was working from home. I was going to go to the Munster Road to get some photocopies done. I walked up and suddenly realised that her car was parked. As I approached her home, I deliberately looked at her front door.
What it seemed to have happened was that Jill Dando had gone to her home address, albeit she wasn't living there anymore, and it would seem that she was attacked and shot effectively on a doorstep just prior to entering her house.
It was a ruthless murder. It wasn't done, the shooting wasn't from a distance. The killer wasn't standing at the gate, he wasn't sort of leaning out of a car, he went right up to her. Pushed her down onto the step so that she was kneeling, placed a gun to her temple and fired a single shot.
There was no time to prepare. From one step to the next, everything changed. Because I was witness to an incredibly violent scene. At first it was difficult in the first few seconds to realise it was actually Jill, and she was actually in that position on her doorstep, leaning against her front door. She had changed colour. There was a lot of blood loss, and instinctively it was clear to me that she was dead.
The gate was firmly closed, and Helen knew it was important not to disturb the crime scene.
I looked around, there was nobody else in the street, and I quickly got my mobile phone to call the emergency services. When I was talking to the emergency services, I said that I thought that she had been stabbed because of the blood loss. It didn't occur to me at that point that it would have been a gun crime. And I added in the conversation, confidentially, it's Jill Dando.
Shocked and distressed, Helen didn't want to be alone.
I remember that I'd seen a neighbour who lives near me. So I ran down the road and knocked on the person's door. My neighbour came to the scene. She took one look and said, "She looks as if she's dead," and ran off further up the road to a doctor's surgery. So I was left on my own again at the scene looking at Jill, who was lifeless on her own doorstep.
The police were first to arrive.
They just went through the gate and started dealing with Jill.
There were mixed reports coming in. There was so much confusion, I think, by everybody because of the nature of the incident and, in reality, the nature of who she was.
They pretty quickly bundled me and the other two, the doctor's receptionist and my neighbour, into Jill's neighbour's home.
Soon after, the paramedics arrived, and then the air ambulance. Jill Dando was taken to Charing Cross Hospital.
She was certified dead at 1:03 p.m. The BBC television presenter Jill Dando has been murdered outside her London home.
A man was seen leaving from outside number 29 Gowan Avenue, and he ran east down this road towards the Fulham Palace Road.
Detectives are now trying to establish a motive for the murder. Our correspondent Fergus Walsh.
I felt completely numb, really, in many respects. It was just the most extraordinary piece of information I think I've ever been given.
In this country, although there are a lot of shootings, they're usually linked to the underworld, crime gangs, teenage gangs. But a lady like this, shot on a doorstep in a West London street, a nice West London street, very respectable, quite well-heeled, was extraordinary.
The image that really is very, very difficult is her beautiful engagement ring with all that hope in it on a very dead hand. Just snuffed out.
Scotland Yard launched into action with Operation Oxborough, the largest criminal investigation since the Yorkshire Ripper.
Regardless of who the victim is, there needs to be a methodical approach to the inquiry. It was just because of the victim, in this case, being such a high-profile celebrity, that everything was increased. For the first few days, almost whole editions of newspapers were filled with this story and nothing else.
Also important to put this in some perspective, because the London police were on the alert searching for the now bomber, David Copeland. And so there was a huge amount of police activity around London and a lot of news media concentration on that issue, because there'd already been two now bombs, one in Brick Lane, one in Brixton, and there was a great deal of concern about where this now bomber was going to strike again and what the reaction would be.
With unprecedented media attention surrounding Metropolitan Police investigations and the victim's high-profile status, the Homicide Squad were fully aware that they were under immense public scrutiny. They faced their first hurdle with a forensic examination of the crime scene.
Yeah, one of the main problems that the police had was that it had been quite severely compromised by the medical services that had been there, by them removing her body once it was clear that there was nothing more that could be done, created some problems. Very little was obtained from that scene. What they had done, I can't criticise that, because I assumed that everything was being done to try and save Miss Dando's life at the time.
There was nothing that came out from the scene other than the fact they, of course, had the bullet which had killed Jill Dando, which was quite unusual. It was crimped, it had been pressed in. They used 50 search officers going down the surrounding streets, and they took up the drains, they looked at the sewers, they looked all along the riverbank by the park in case that the gunman might just have tossed the gun over a hedge or threw it into a drain.
We can't be sure, obviously, about the gun that was used because it's never been recovered. But the thinking was that it was in some way a reactivated gun, or one that had in some way been adapted.
With a serious lack of forensics from the crime scene, the homicide squad turned their attention to examining the witness statements.
There was no eyewitness to the actual offence. Several witnesses gave information about a man who was present at the scene before and immediately after, and one of the main focuses of the inquiry was to identify this person.
Richard, her neighbour, said that he had heard her set her car alarm and that he had heard a scream, looked out of the window, and he'd seen somebody go past further down Gowan Avenue.
He walked very calmly away from the scene, and when I actually saw him, I thought nothing of it. I thought, in fact, it could have been a friend of Jill's when I heard the screaming. That's why I particularly at that moment didn't do anything that now I wish I could have done.
One of the problems that the team was faced with was the unprecedented amount of information that was being received within the incident room. During the course of the inquiry, over 2,000 people were named as being responsible or in some way involved in Miss Dando's murder. Without a clear witness or without a clear motive and reason, stranger murders are by definition the most difficult to investigate.
In a sad twist of fate, Scotland Yard turned to the programme Jill Dando presented before her death, Crimewatch, to help find her killer.
You never imagine in your wildest dreams the idea that you would ever have, or we would ever have had to make an appeal about somebody we knew so well.
Hello? Hiya. She's from Crimewatch.
There was a pressure on us to think that we could do something to help, to use the programme and to use our experience to try and help in some way. And I think everyone was actually really relieved that they could feel that they could do something. The appeal itself to find information regarding Jill's killer produced a lot of phone calls.
Several witnesses saw a man in the area earlier in the morning. And then there are various sightings of a man in a sort of waxed jacket. We have somebody who saw what they described as a sweating man at a bus stop. We have another sweating man seen in Fulham Palace Park, or Fulham Park, which is opposite, quite close to Gowan Avenue, who was talking on a mobile phone. So there are lots of different little sort of sightings, but nobody actually saw the attack.
One of the main purposes of the inquiry is to try and separate the potential suspect from other people.
And I think as the months went on, it was quite apparent that this was going to be a long investigation.
As the police persevered with their inquiry, thousands of mourners lined the streets to watch the 3-mile cortege. The funeral service of Jill Dando took place at Clarence Park Baptist Church in Weston-super-Mare. A grieving nation mounted pressure on Operation Oxborough. Would the homicide squad ever find Jill's killer and bring him to justice?
So, if any of tonight's reconstructions have helped jog your memory...
BBC television presenter Jill Dando was the nation's sweetheart. But in April 1999, she was violently murdered with a single gunshot fired at close range to her head. Her killer fled the scene undetected. What followed was a lengthy and extensive inquiry, but the Metropolitan Police faced a serious lack of evidence. No murder weapon, no motive, and no eyewitness. They were facing mounting pressure from the country's press and public to bring Jill's killer to justice.
What we needed to be sure of, was she followed, wasn't she followed? There was a small and dedicated group of officers that meticulously went through every scrap of footage that we had during the course of the inquiry. What we can categorically say is that from the meticulous examination of the footage from 191 cameras, she wasn't followed at all to that address.
They also searched through 80,000 mobile phone records for the Fulham area and also for Chiswick, which could in some way be linked to her death. Either somebody following her who passed on a message that she was on her way home, or somebody who was waiting and got the message that she was arriving. None of those phone calls produced any evidence either.
The months rolled by, but no significant leads emerged. The police were struggling with a serious lack of evidence.
Her filofax had 486 names in it, and they went through every name and address they could find. They looked at her fiance's background and drew a blank on that.
We obviously just stayed at my house.
I realised that on day one, I was probably on a list of potential suspects being first on the scene. That's a normal thing. The nearest and dearest of a victim are always scrutinised, and I knew that I would be too.
Because of the nature of who Miss Dando was and her work, it was hard to ascertain a definitive motive as to why someone would conceivably want to kill her.
Due to constant media attention, there was immense pressure to make an arrest, but they were fast exhausting all their leads. By now, Operation Oxborough decided to change tack. They were beginning to consider the possibility that Jill Dando's killer was a stalker with obsessive tendencies.
Like a lot of celebrities, she'd attracted a lot of unhealthy interest. They found, for example, that one man had tried to acquire her BT account and run it unknown to her, but which would allow him to look at her phone calls or phone numbers. They found that somebody else had 150 pictures on his, of her collected on his computer. Another man had attempted to take over her utility bills, electricity, gas, water. Extraordinary behaviour by some of these people. But the police looked at about 4,000 people, I think it was, of whom about 150 seemed to have what they would have described as an unhealthy interest in her. But at the end of the day, none of these had showed any evidence of taking their interest further than a fantasy or a fixation.
As the investigation reached its first anniversary, detectives decided to re-examine the early information they received soon after the shooting to see if there was anything they missed. Amongst other names, a man who lived half a mile from Jill's house was brought to their attention. Barry Michael George.
George had a conviction for a sex attack in the 1980s. He also discovered that there was a reference on his file to the fact he'd been arrested in the grounds of one of the royal palaces with a length of rope around his shoulder and a knife. And the palace concern was the one where the Prince of Wales and Princess Diana were then living. And they found that he'd been stopped by police in the 1990s for following women. Nobody at Fulham Police Station actually knew anything about him, interestingly. Barry George turned out to be a very long way down the suspect list.
He was described as a loner. And he was almost a usual, one of the usual suspects, because the police hadn't found anybody and they came back to him.
Barry George had been reported to the police in the early days following Jill's murder.
A detective constable called John Gallagher discovered a message about a man called Busara, which had come in from Hafad, which was a local drop-in centre for disabled people, very close to the scene of the shooting, in which they said that this man Busara had seemed very agitated and they were concerned about him. The policeman did some checking and found that Busara cross-referred to Barry George.
Barry George often claimed he was the cousin of British musician Freddie Mercury, using the alias Barry Bulsara.
To some extent, he was living in a fantasy world, especially in relation to Queen and music and all the rest of it. But this is it. It was an overtly fantastical world where, he wasn't hiding away.
He also took the name Paul Gadd, which was Gary Glitter's real name. He also used the name Steve Powers, who was an SAS soldier who took part in the Iranian embassy siege. And he also used the name Lee Majors, who was a stuntman and Hollywood star at one stage. And he was actually convicted for several offences under some of these aliases, bizarrely. But it's just an example of the sort of fantasy life he led. And for the police, at the time that they were looking at him as a strong suspect, that all added to the mix.
I think most people who lived in Fulham were aware of Barry George wandering around the streets. He's quite distinctive. He was somebody who probably needed a little bit more help than he had in the community.
But further investigations into police records during the early days of their inquiry revealed more.
By now, police were getting very concerned because they also knew, looking through their records, that a local taxi firm had also called the police soon after the shooting to say they were concerned about a man who kept coming in and seemed to be trying to build up what, as it appeared to the police, to be constructing an alibi for himself.
Timings were crucial, of course, because the killing took place at around 11:30 in the morning. Question, where was he? And his case was that he'd attended at a local agency, Hafad, housing agency, and that he'd gone home and changed clothing, and he'd gone to a park and gone to get a taxi somewhere else. And so his defensive alibi was that he wasn't in the road when it happened.
Detectives decided to place him under surveillance and carefully monitored his every move.
We had access to a whole load of black and white photographs taken of him in the street. My recollection is that those photographs didn't take it anywhere. In other words, yes, he's looking a bit furtive in the street, because he always looks a bit furtive.
The investigation revealed that Barry George had a history of following and photographing women.
There was one case of, I think it was a woman in a bus queue, and then he got on the bus with her. Now, this is very overt behaviour. In other words, it is somebody who is, I think, desperately anxious to create a relationship, which he hasn't got, with somebody. And so it's an unhappy situation, and it's very unpleasant, I suspect, for any woman who is on the receiving end of this treatment. And in a sense, he needs help if that's what was going on. But this is a long way away from the nature of this crime, which wasn't about following Jill Dando around in order to create a relationship.
The psychological profilers were talking about somebody who might well fantasize, who might, for example, have fantasized over Princess Diana, somebody who'd had difficult relationships in the past, which Barry George had had. All of these things added to the list of things that ticked off that made him a very strong suspect, and then eventually the strongest suspect.
Over a year after Jill's murder, and based on their findings, Met Police were confident there was sufficient evidence to arrest Barry George.
4 unarmed officers, or that is what Scotland Yard still maintains, arrested him, and they began a search of his home. And that is when things became interesting.
Okay, start the search. I mean, Barry George's flat was absolutely stacked to the ceiling with old newspapers. You could barely get in it. So he, again, might be regarded as an oddball for keeping all these newspaper cuttings and so on. But, so, yes, there was a sort of obsessive side to this man because he collected things, but I know lots of people who collect things. Maybe not to that extent. Obsessive of Jill Dando? Absolutely not. You know, you would think that if he was obsessed with Jill Dando, he would have accumulated quite a library, because she was in the newspapers very regularly. None of it was cut out, none of it was highlighted. There were no notes anywhere suggesting he was wanting to find out where Jill Dando was at any one time.
Detectives removed various items.
They took a coat that he'd worn and sent it for examination. They developed about 100 reels of film which he had, which showed that he'd been stalking around about, I think it's 480 women.
Police investigation also revealed that he had an interest in firearms. Barry George was interviewed at Hammersmith Police Station in London.
This is a man who originally had told the police that he had nothing to do with guns and hadn't had anything to do with guns for quite a long time. But police found that, for example, he tried to join the parachute regiment, the TA section of it. He tried to join the regular army. He belonged for a short time to a gun club in Kensington. He'd had a number of starter pistols. A former neighbour of his had seen him with a weapon.
After he was arrested, it was plain he did have an interest in firearms. I mean, he didn't have the weapon that is said to have been used here, but he did have an interest in weapons. But that doesn't mean that he's the murderer.
He said he had nothing to do with Jill Dando. He didn't know Jill Dando lived in the area. He'd never met her, never seen her, and denied any link at all to the murder.
Barry George was asked to take part in an ID parade.
He refused to go on an ID parade, and so the ID parades were done on a laptop with potential witnesses being shown a series of images of possible suspects, plus innocent people, and picking them out from a laptop display.
There was a neighbour living right next door to Jill Dando who was looking out on the road, and a man living opposite. They both saw somebody departing from the gate area where this had happened. And they both went to identification parades, and neither of them picked out Barry George. In fact, either one or both picked out someone else.
Whilst Barry George was being held in custody, forensics made an interesting discovery.
Everything gelled for the police when they were told by the forensic science experts that they had found a very, very tiny trace of firearms discharge in the pocket of the coat that had been taken away. It was said to measure around about 0.005 of an inch. It was tiny. But the interesting thing about it was that the chemical composition, according to the scientists, was exactly the same as the bullet which had killed Jill Dando.
They also found a single fibre at the crime scene that matched the material of a pair of trousers owned by prime suspect Barry George. On the 29th of May 2000, Barry George was formally charged for the murder. Were Metropolitan Police finally going to get justice for Jill? The murder inquiry into BBC TV presenter Jill Dando's death was fast becoming one of the largest and most expensive police investigations to ever take place in Britain. Operation Oxborough traced, interviewed and eliminated thousands of suspects in the months following Jill's death. A year later, local resident Barry George emerged as a prime suspect. Following closer inspection into his criminal history and police surveillance, they arrested him. It was during a raid on his flat that some of his personal possessions were removed and examined. When forensics revealed a small amount of gunpowder trace in his coat pocket and a thread from his trousers linking him to the crime scene, the homicide squad formally charged Barry George with the murder of Jill Dando.
Barry George's arrest had incited quite a lot of actually adverse publicity, which I think was very, very unfortunate. The public were sympathetic to a very famous, very intelligent, very beautiful woman who'd been killed at her front doorstep. And so there's an outpouring of grief, and therefore anyone who's arrested for that immediately has a problem.
Almost 1 year after his arrest, the trial for the murder of Jill Dando finally took place at the Old Bailey. It was a trial that would captivate the nation and prove to be one of the most controversial cases in British criminal history. Barry George pleaded not guilty.
A trial at the Old Bailey for anyone is a pressured event, especially if it's in one of the old courts, which it was, because they've held many famous trials. Certainly most of the UK press and media were there on a daily basis. So the court was full of people interested in the result.
I mean, it's a very dramatic trial. He sat throughout it in the dock with a psychiatrist because he was concerned about his ability to follow the case.
He suffered from very, very serious epilepsy, difficulties about concentration and so on. So this made communication a very sensitive area.
During the trial, the prosecution presented George as a lone gunman with stalker tendencies. But his defense counsel painted a different picture.
Was it an assassination?
We tried to present Barry George, obviously as the person that he was, just very vulnerable person, living in the locality, relatively well known in the locality, who had an alibi, which he'd obviously produced to the jury, and basically as somebody who, in a sense, wasn't capable of carrying out this murder.
The case against Barry George centred on forensic findings.
The gun residue was clearly the key issue because it linked, according to the prosecution, it directly linked Barry George to a gun, to the murder.
As far as we were concerned, our experts said that one particle doesn't add up to even a row of beans. It means nothing forensically. We also examined very, very carefully the possibility of contamination at the laboratory, because one particle can be airborne, one particle can go from one surface to another surface, to a hand, to somewhere else. And we examined very carefully whether, in fact, at any time, the particle hadn't been in the pocket but had got into the pocket through a process of contamination. You have to remember, no firearms residue was found in his flat or found in anything else to do with him. So if he's supposed to be adapting weapons or playing around with weapons, where was he doing it? He certainly wasn't doing it in his flat. He didn't own lots of flats all over London. One had to examine the possibility that it had got there through an accident of continuity. In other words, it was contamination.
The prosecution relied heavily on the identification evidence. They relied on a fibre which they found, which they said linked Barry George's trouser to Jill Dando, that the fibre had come off the trousers and onto her clothing.
The case hung on the slenderest thread, that was the sort of comparison, and the slenderest thread was this one particle. Because the identification evidence of him being in the street 2 hours before, in my view, was weak. You know, an identification is reputedly very risky. So what else is there? So the fibres in the case were going nowhere.
George's defence team were putting forward a strong case.
This case depended largely on circumstantial evidence. And plainly, from a prosecution point of view, forensic scientific evidence can be rather more compelling than any other.
It was circumstantial, and they admitted it was circumstantial, but the judge and the prosecution both said that it was possible to convict on the basis of circumstantial evidence without, for example, a confession, without an eyewitness who had actually seen a gun used, without the gun itself, without a motive.
The jury retired to deliberate. 5 days later, they'd finally reached a verdict.
Foreman of the jury, have you reached a verdict?
We have, my lord.
A jury of 6 women and 5 men found Barry George guilty of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison.
It was a shock. Obviously for Barry George, but a shock for all of the defence team, and I dare say others in court who had believed, as I had, that this wasn't going to lead to a conviction.
For the majority, it was a simple case of a mentally ill man, or a man who was clearly not in his right senses, infatuated, fantasised, had approached Jill Dando, she had rebuffed him, he had killed her. That's the way it came across in a lot of newspapers and the media generally.
I was very upset, I was very angry, the fact that he'd been convicted. I had plenty of time to think back over the trial and say, well, what's gone wrong here? How did this jury come to that conclusion? I think it's probably a combination of somebody who kind of looked odd in the dock, somebody who looked odd, which fitted the publicity that had gone before. Secondly, I think there was pressure on this jury, feeling that the nature of the crime was so heinous that, you know, here was an odd man and he lived in the area and there was a firearms particle. And they put that together, I think.
Barry George always protested his innocence. But as he started his life sentence, there was unease at the verdict.
From that point on, people began to get behind Barry George, to campaign for a fresh look at the case, and arguing that there was something wrong here, that it was a miscarriage of justice. His defence managed to mount an appeal. As the years went on and Barry George remained in prison, a campaign built up to get him free.
After an appeal and 8 years in jail, vital new forensic research cast doubt over the significance of the gunpowder traces.
The Court of Appeal had argued that if the evidence in the pocket had been found a day or so after the murder, then it was key evidence. There was a link. But because there had been such a long period of time, it was no longer safe to assume it was linked to the murder. There were also points made about the fibre which was found on Jill Dando. The clothing she'd been wearing had been left at the scene for quite a long time after the shooting. So it's perfectly possible for that fibre, which is fairly common, to have come from another source and not from Barry George's trousers.
The forensic evidence was deemed unsafe. The Court of Appeal set a date for the retrial.
The prosecution maintained that he was an obsessionist with a fantasy about guns and a grudge against the BBC. The defence simply said, what we have here is the police have arrested the local nutter. And that was the phrase used by William Clegg QC, who now appeared for Barry George. And the jury accepted that there wasn't sufficient evidence.
After 8 years in prison, Barry George was finally cleared of the murder of Jill Dando.
Because I'm a firm believer that the truth will out in the end and justice will be done, but some people have to wait far longer than he did. And to give him his due, his persistence, his self-belief, that got him acquitted.
So who did kill Jill Dando?
There wasn't a clear explanation. It wasn't a sex attack, it wasn't a robbery. It was an assassination of some description, and that left people very, very puzzled.
I mean, I believed throughout the case, because of the nature of the evidence and the window of opportunity, it had to have been carried out by a professional.
What we were all conscious of throughout the inquiry was what a senseless crime this was. And the feeling of shock, to a degree, throughout the country never really diminished.
It was just extraordinary, and please God, nothing ever like this happens again.
On the morning of March the 13th, 1996, the city of Dumblane in Scotland was changed forever.
A middle-aged loner fixated on youngsters, guns and his own grievances
killed 16 children and their teacher.
And then committed suicide.
That will go down in history as one of the worst massacres ever.
Nobody had planned for anything like this in Dunblane.
There's just so many people crying and panicked.
16 children and their teacher were brutally shot and murdered at Dunblane Primary School before the perpetrator turned the gun on himself.
The lasting image for me would be being in among the crowd of frantic parents. Life changed completely and forever for these people, and I was a part of that, and it's something you never forget.
A senseless crime so devastating it sent shockwaves across the world as people reeled with the loss and called for urgent changes in gun laws, making this a crime that shook Britain.
I can't get the images out of my head yet, and I think that will take some time. It was an appalling mess. Evil visited us yesterday, and we don't know why. We don't understand it, and I guess we never will.
In 1996, Thomas Hamilton stormed into a local primary school and opened fire. In an unprovoked attack, a class were targeted with horrific consequences. In this programme, we tell the inside story through the eyes of the parents and professionals at the centre of the tragedy.
For training, Gary.
Charlotte was our first child, obviously a joy to us. We'd been married 5 years before we decided to have a family, so she was a little girl.
Sophie was, I'm sure, a very typical 5-year-old girl, full of life, bubbly. I found her a joy to be with. We could have intelligent conversations together.
She grew up. As the years went on, she was a tomboy. She liked climbing the trees and rolling in the garden. She was, life and soul of the house, and she had a brother all of a sudden to start beating up as well. And she was bright, and she was intelligent and a good person.
We had a very intimate family life. Sophie's mum had died 2.5 years beforehand, so we spent a lot of time in each other's company. We had our own sort of routine way of doing things. Sophie became a companion as well as a daughter because we did go to so many places together. She was with me much of the time.
Morning, Dad. Morning. What would you like for breakfast this morning?
We had breakfast together. Sophie had Cocoa Pops.
And what have you got at school today?
On the morning of the 13th of March, Mick and his daughter Sophie got ready for the day ahead.
Come on, let's get this jumper on. Here we go. Ready?
We got up somewhere between 7 and 7:30. I made sure that Sophie got dressed.
Okay, let's go. Good girl.
Across town, Martin Dunn and his family were starting their day.
We were planning to move away from Scotland because of job movements. So although we'd only been here a very short time, we were going to be moving south within the month.
Have you got your keys?
So at that time, I was not so rushed to go in and out of work. It was a normal morning. It was breakfast time. Charlotte loved going to school, so there was not a problem of saying, come on, get ready. She was up and ready, she was bubbly. She loved her breakfast, so we all had breakfast.
Charlotte Dunn and Sophie North both attended Dunblane Primary School. They had started in the lower class 7 months earlier.
She packed her belongings all in a bag. She just went to school with a smile, as she did every day, really.
See you tonight then, honey.
Hi. Love you. Bye.
I took Sophie to Kids Club, where she went before and after school. Sophie would be at Kids Club for half an hour, 3/4 of an hour before school started, and would go over to her classroom at around 9 o'clock. In fact, I was never quite sure of the timings of things to do with the school. My duties were to drop her off at Kids Club and pick her up from Kids Club. So the bit in between was a bit of a mystery sometimes.
I actually took Charlotte to school on that morning, so dropped her off at school, stood with her until the bell rang, playing with her friends and introducing me to some of the other children who I'd probably not seen before. So that was quite different for me, because I hadn't done that normally.
This is my dad.
We looked at where we wanted to live when we took the decision to move to Scotland. Dumblane had a good reputation for schools, which was a big decision for ourselves, that we wanted the right school for Charlotte. It was a sleepy village compared to a sprawling industrial Midlands that we came from, so it was novel for us.
With Sophie and Charlotte at school, Mick and Martin went to work.
I drove from Dunblane after I dropped Sophie off to go to Stirling University, where I worked, and spent a couple of hours doing the usual things I would do at work, mostly based in my office.
I was working in Stirling at the time, so it was just a normal day in the office. Approximately 10 o'clock, we had a phone call from one of our sites, some guys saying, have you heard the news?
After I'd been at work for 2 hours, a colleague came to my office door and asked if I'd heard anything about a shooting at Dumblane High School.
What's happened?
He then corrected himself and said primary school. He'd had a phone call from one of our students. He'd heard on the radio about a shooting.
He says, oh, there's been an incident in Dunblane, there's been a shooting, it's on the news.
A shooting at a school was difficult to comprehend. With limited details, the fathers began searching for more information.
Unfortunately, I was the first one to take this message, so having finished the phone call with Mike, I put the phone down and went and got the other parents and said, look, I've been told there's something happening in Dunblane. We need to find out.
Hello, is that Dumblane School?
One of the guys picked up the phone, rang the school, managed to get through, and we were just told that, yes, there'd been an incident. Could you please come to the school and fetch your children?
I tried calling Dumblane Police Office, couldn't get any answer. So there was no information apart from these rumours.
We don't know if Sophie's involved.
I remember just a typical news day with the TV's on, and then telephones started to ring and people were saying something's happened at Dunblane, there's been a shooting at a primary. Nobody was really sure of what was going on.
Anna?
And more telephones rang and reporters were assigned to start phoning people. I just remember there was a little bit of confusion, but like tension and worry building up, because you kind of knew there was some kind of drama unfolding anyway. Somebody was saying kids have been shot.
The residents of Dumblane have been stunned by horrific news. Initial reports claim of a shooting in the local primary school, but information was limited. Only 2 hours earlier, Mick North had dropped his 5-year-old daughter, Sophie, off for her classes. Martin Dunn had said goodbye to his daughter, Charlotte, in the school playground. After hearing of the incident, they desperately try to find out exactly what has happened.
I got back towards Dunblane and it was chaos. I mean, the roads were jammed. I ended up parking on the local Tesco's car park, made my way up to the school on foot. There was lines of police officers there asking who your child was, what year she was in, and people were then being sent one way or another.
I didn't really panic at that time. I was obviously worried and concerned, but no one had any information. And I waited until somebody else came along and asked if I would like to have a lift back to Dunblane. And I said, yes, I probably should go.
So if there's trouble, we're going up there, come on.
Immediately we were dispatched a team of reporters, and we had the features editor of the record, Alan Rennie. He had 2 kids at Dunblane. He was from Dunblane, so he was obviously immediately, the whole office was turned out. Nobody knows who's been shot, whether it's teachers or whatever. So you had a sense of terror.
We didn't really have any information to go on. So it wasn't until we got close to the school that it was apparent that this was something major.
By the time the parents reached the school, crowds of concerned residents were forming, and the world's media was already descending.
I got sent at that time across the road to a house the other side of the school. I was told to go there, and when I got there, my wife was already inside waiting. We just started to sit and wait till the parents came along, and then we suddenly realised this was all the one particular class. So we started to realise, I think, at that time that we were different to all the other families.
Eventually, somebody came in and said that the incident only concerned one class, and that was Mrs. Mayer's. And perhaps it was only then that I started getting really concerned.
Gwen Mayer had a class of 30 pupils, 5- and 6-year-olds that included Sophie and Charlotte. After the announcement, those parents concerned were taken out of the house and moved inside the school to wait for further news.
There was doctors from the surgery and some of the ministers, local ministers, but they were like everyone else. They were just generally chatting. We were just waiting and waiting. There was no information coming through.
Dunblane Primary School was one of the largest in Scotland. So there were over 600, nearly 700 pupils there. So the chances that your own child has been affected by anything are quite small. But, of course, as soon as you're told that it only affects her class, then everything changes. From that point onwards, the demands for information increased. We were being told nothing, except that we would hear in 2 or 3 minutes. There was a senior police officer who'd been put in charge of us, and he kept on saying, 2 minutes, 2 minutes, we will tell you in 2 minutes.
16 sets of parents had been ushered into a room by police, but had no information about the welfare of their children. Helplessly, they had to sit and wait for news.
And then all of a sudden, some people came into the room, read out a list of names and asked those people to move on. And obviously at that time, we didn't know, are those the people that have got bad news or is it good news?
As officers tried to deal with the scale of the incident, outside, police called for backup from other forces, as more crowds gathered, waiting for answers.
I remember standing looking back and people just rushing straight up, and terror, just terror. Everybody sensed it. There was a big emergency operation ongoing. It was terrifying. I just stood at the side entrance to the school. You could smell the fear and you could feel the fear.
Here in Dunblane, a scene of hell and damnation is how a teacher described...
Police continued to allow parents some access to the building in order to collect those children not affected. Meanwhile, just yards away in the staff room, officers were giving little away.
As parents, you always need to know where your child is. And here we were, not being told anything. We had taken our children to school that morning. We had left them in the care of the school, yet we didn't know where they were. We weren't being told where they were. We weren't being told what had happened to them. I had a friend with me who I'd met up with. She'd been Sophie's nursery teacher, and she very kindly said she'd stay with me until I had some news. And obviously everything was going through our heads. Is she alive? If she's alive, is she injured? Is she waiting desperately to meet up with me? Or is she dead? They were all thoughts, they were all possibilities.
As parents waited for news, Anna and her colleague tried to gather more information.
It was an eerie atmosphere, just like numb and people coming out, kids coming out crying. There was obviously some parents there coming to get their kids out. Because I was with Alan and because he had children at the school, he was able to go through the police lines, and I went with him right into the school. I will remember for the rest of my life being struck by the cloakroom. There were all these wee pegs, which are only about the height of 5 and 6 year olds. But in this cloakroom was all these wee coats hanging.
A terrible set of circumstances has occurred at Dunblane Primary School this morning.
The community in Dumblane has been devastated by tragic news. Early reports tell of a shooting in the local primary school. Parents rush to their children, but are told little else, only that one class is affected. As concerned residents and the world's media descend, frantically trying to discover what has happened, affected families have been ushered into the school staff room. Mick North has waited hours for any news on his daughter, Sophie.
I sat there as patiently as possible. I probably wasn't one of those people sort of demanding immediate information. But 2 hours after I'd been there, a group of 3 people came in and called out to speak to the North family. My mind just spun through everything.
Mick, along with the other families, knew nothing about his daughter's welfare at this point. Only that a shooting had occurred and Gwen Mayer's class had been affected.
We got to the other classroom. The next thing Derek, the police officer, said was, you'll know there's been an incident, a shooting incident, in which 16 children have died.
Mrs. May's class was the class involved. There has been a shooting at the school.
That was the first time I'd heard the number 16. And it changed my thoughts on everything. Once he said there were 16, that matched the number of us who were left. So he didn't need to be telling me, which he did next, that Sophie was one of them, because I'd already worked that out very quickly. They told me Sophie's teacher had been killed and that the perpetrator was dead.
5-year-old Sophie North had just started gym class with the rest of her group when a gunman entered the school and began shooting.
It's always been very hard to recall exactly how I felt the moment that the news was confirmed. I know how I felt a few minutes later. I felt anger. I felt anger at these people who I'd only just met because they told me to wait a bit longer, and I got angry and I said I'd been waiting so many hours to find out that my daughter had been killed. I wasn't going to wait any longer. They were doing it out of kindness. They were trying to arrange a car to take me home.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get angry. Don't worry, we'll have to break the news.
I then apologised for getting angry, and then I just felt numb. I suspect the brain sort of shuts down lots of the thought processes because they're too hard at that time, and that's how numbness kicks in.
Someone came in and asked the question, is that all the parents gone? No, there's still 2 of us here. So they went away and they came back and the Ross family were taken away. So that left just myself and Barbara in this room, a room that was an hour ago pretty full. Police officers and the social worker sat us down, and that was when they just said, unfortunately, there's been a shooting, there's no easy way to say this, your daughter's been shot. And unfortunately, she's not survived, so your daughter was dead. So that's when my world sort of fell apart. I just broke down, just cried, why and why.
Charlotte Dunn was in the same class as Sophie North. Both girls were murdered, along with 14 of their friends and their teacher, Gwen Mayer.
Reality started to sink in, and it was just, it was just numbing, really. It was just numbing, and disbelief, still saying no, it's not us.
Martin and Barbara were taken back to the family home.
We had to start contacting family to tell them the worst possible news that they wanted. My parents and Barbara's parents were already in transit to Scotland from the Midlands, so we took a conscious decision not to tell them until they arrived.
I got back to a house that was obviously empty, but seemed even more empty than it should have been. The answer machine was full of messages, and playing them through, you could hear the same people phoning a number of times, getting increasingly worried.
Hi Mick, it's Dave. Can you call me back? Hi Mick, it's Dave again. Can you give me a call back?
I shut myself away for the first week or so after Sophie's death. Surprisingly, for someone who reads newspapers quite avidly, watches TV news quite a lot, I just didn't want to know what was being reported.
Here in Dunblane, a scene of hell and damnation is how...
As the families tried desperately to absorb what had happened to them, details of the massacre began to unfold.
Was it in one classroom, sir? It was in a gymnasium.
A crazed gunman had committed the most horrific crime against 16 innocent children. He was identified by police as 43-year-old unemployed former shopkeeper and scout leader Thomas Hamilton. Just a few hours earlier, he had travelled 7 miles from his house in nearby Stirling to the primary school with a premeditated plan.
He'd hired a rental van the day before, and he drove it to Dumblane and was seen parking the vehicle in the school car park at about 9:30. He then cut telephone wires. It's assumed that he thought he was cutting the wires to the school. In fact, he cut them to local houses, so the school's telephone actually still worked. He then went into the school. No one is exactly sure how he got in. Dumblane Primary School, a rambling building, lots of different entrances, but he wasn't seen going in.
The children had gone to the classroom first, and because they were doing gym immediately after assembly, they changed into their gym kit.
2 of Gwen Mayer's pupils were absent that day, so 28 boys and girls eagerly changed for their gym class and then went to assembly.
So they were in the assembly ended. They went into the gym, which is the room next door.
He went to the assembly hall. It's also assumed that he thought that the assembly would be taking place then. He'd asked a boy the week before what time the assembly took place, and the boy misinformed him and told him it was 9:30.
He obviously went into the assembly hall looking for the children. They were not there, but he heard noise in the hall, so he'd moved to the hall.
250 of the school's pupils had attended assembly that morning. Once Hamilton realised he'd missed his intended target, he fired a bullet into the stage and one into the girls' toilets nearby.
No one will know whether that was a deliberate move to go to the gym or whether it was because it just happened to be the nearest room. He then walked in. He was pointing the gun. He shot at the adults, and then he shot at the children.
Gwen Mayer, Eileen Harold and Mary Blake were just about to start their gym class with the pupils. Hamilton opened fire as soon as he entered the hall. They had no time to react.
There were 3 teachers in the gym that morning. Gwen Mayer was shot and killed immediately. The other 2 teachers were badly injured but managed to get into a storeroom, and some children who survived the shooting managed to get in there with them, and they hid in there, hoping that Hamilton wouldn't find them. He continued shooting for about 3 minutes, which must have felt like an agonisingly long time for those in the storeroom.
Although badly injured and terrified, the teachers tried desperately not to attract the gunman's attention. As Hamilton fired indiscriminately at other pupils and staff, 2 other children and a teacher in Primary 7 were injured.
At one point he actually went out of the gym, fired at a couple of other classes before coming back in, shooting again, and then finally killing himself.
The children and their teacher who were murdered received 58 gunshot wounds. A further 10 pupils were seriously wounded. Only 2 children out of the whole class escaped without injury. Head teacher Ron Taylor was the first to make a call to police after hearing gunshots and went immediately to the gym. Other members of staff, also alerted by the sound, followed to be faced with the unthinkable. Those in the storeroom, fearing for their lives, were eventually rescued by the staff and an off-duty police officer who was dropping his children at the school. The outpouring of grief over the next few days was unprecedented, as news of the mass murder rippled across the globe.
Dunblane had become the centrepiece of the world. Donations and cards started to flow in. Goodwill from all around the world was sent. The press intrusion at the time didn't really affect us because we were being guarded, but you saw people being interviewed in the street.
As the once peaceful Scottish town became the focal point of the world, the people of Dunblane demanded answers. What had driven this man to commit this horrific act of violence? And how was it allowed to happen?
Within the first evening, people knew that this guy was everybody knew his name, and people knew he was a kind of oddball character.
He'd been a scout leader who had been asked to leave the Scouts, but he had continued running boys' clubs.
Hamilton's conduct with boys in his scout group had seriously been called into question. So much so that after one particular complaint from 2 boys, the association revoked his warrant and blacklisted him. He had been with them less than a year. Despite being struck off, he tried to enter the Scouts again in a county 10 miles away. His attempt failed, so Hamilton went on to form his own boys' clubs.
There have been a lot of complaints about Thomas Hamilton over the years concerning the way he ran his boys' clubs. Some people considered too strict. But that was balanced at the time by people who were quite happy for their boys to go along to these. So there were mixed messages coming out. What was quite telling was that the number of boys who were going to the clubs was decreasing as time went on. He obviously believed that this was because rumours were being spread about him. There were attempts made to charge him over the conduct at some of the boys' camps, but charges weren't eventually brought.
Hamilton also held a firearms licence for 19 years, target shooting at least 3 gun clubs in the area.
It had all these guns and it had its licence renewed, and also there was some kind of talk that it had been reported to the police as maybe you shouldn't renew his licence, and for any guns, and he had licence for loads of guns, never mind just one. So there was a question mark over did the police do the right thing here?
Hamilton's firearms licence had to be reviewed every 5 years. On each occasion, authorities allowed him to continue legally owning guns and thousands of rounds of ammunition.
On the day, he got 4 weapons with him, 4 weapons which he had licences for. And he had 1,500 rounds of ammunition in a bag. Why does anyone need 1,500 rounds of ammunition in a house? Why does anyone need 4 handguns? Of varying calibers.
And as parents learnt more about Hamilton's background, further warning signs began to emerge.
We learned that at least one police officer had recommended that those guns should have been taken away from him, that he shouldn't have held a firearms licence. That recommendation was ignored by senior officers.
What happened yesterday cannot be understood.
16 innocent children and their teacher, Miss Mayer, have been murdered in a cold and calculated attack at their primary school in Dunblane, Scotland. Thomas Hamilton, a local gun enthusiast, entered the school heavily armed and opened fire on a Primary 1 class. As the families try to deal with the unimaginable pain, further light is shed on Hamilton's past.
The biggest concern about Thomas Hamilton's ownership of firearms had been when a child protection officer had been investigating a particular camp that he had run and had written to senior officers that he believed that Thomas Hamilton's behaviour at the camp made him an inappropriate person to hold firearms. He also felt that Thomas Hamilton had been devious and had not been truthful in answers he had given.
Despite numerous concerns, Hamilton continued to run his boys' clubs and retained his firearms licence. A licence that allowed him to legally possess the weapons that eventually ended the lives of so many children and their teacher.
I think there's no doubt that a lot of things could have been done. I think a bit more intelligence within Central Scotland Police Force would have prompted an attempt to take the weapons away. The broader question of firearms ownership, yes, I do think something could have been done about that as well.
Parents felt urgent changes in the gun laws needed to be made.
The Snowdrop campaign started as a petition to ban guns in this country. That was started by a group of mothers with emotion, and that rolled, and we got quite a lot of signatures.
The Snowdrop campaign attracted worldwide support. Thousands signed the petition, along with another campaign by the Sunday Mail newspaper, to completely ban legally held guns in the UK. As lobbying gathered pace, Martin and his family had another painful event to deal with.
We had made plans to move back to England because of a job move. So we'd already purchased a house in England, so we'd got a moving date. We'd got a moving date of the 29th of March. So 13th of March happened. We had a funeral to arrange. We then had a room that we'd just shut away immediately. Charlotte's bedroom had been closed up. Only myself and Barbara had been in that room since the day. And as the moving date came closer, we were forced really to go into that room and to put everything in boxes. There was tears shed, obviously, memories. You see little girls' clothes and their toys. It was all in the room, and it was a difficult time, yeah.
Just 2 weeks after Charlotte's murder, the Dunns had to pack their daughter's possessions and move from the family home. 2 months on from the tragedy, a public inquiry opened, led by Lord Cullen, to investigate the circumstances surrounding the massacre.
The Cullen inquiry really took on board all the events of the day. It looked at legislation, etc. And certain key witnesses were called to give evidence and advice in their specialist fields. From that, Lord Cullen went away and debated what could come out of the inquiry, and there were certain recommendations made in the Cullen inquiry, which was like, a review of handgun legislation and a potential ban on handguns.
The inquiry also included shocking details from the crime scene.
We were told of Charlotte's injuries. We were told that she was shot 3 times, once through the head, once through the shoulder blade, and once out through her side. So that, although that wasn't the news we didn't really want, it also helps with closure. From there we were given little piece by piece bits of more information of what had happened on the day.
Charlotte Dunn. As parents listened to harrowing details surrounding their child's death, the urge to ban legally held guns grew. 4 months on from the tragedy, the people of Dumblane forced Parliament to listen to their plight, with over 705,000 signatures backing their appeal for a change in gun legislation.
We took boxes upon boxes of A4 paper signed to Parliament. We all went down on a coach. We started to see MPs to campaign for a ban.
These were petitions, and whether or not they were successful they would have limited time. But it was also important to have something more permanent in place, an organisation that could put pressure on the government and politicians to make sure that safety from guns was given equal importance to any issues about the ownership of guns and using them for sport or whatever.
Mick North, along with other parents, felt a permanent organisation was needed, one that could lobby against the legal use of firearms in the UK for years to come. So the Gun Control Network was formed. This, along with the Snowdrop campaign, became a formidable force from people demanding change.
Thomas Hamilton's guns had been legally owned. His ammunition was legally owned. You couldn't think of a situation where anyone would have that amount of ammunition.
We wanted a total ban. We didn't see the need for any guns held in private ownership.
The Conservative government at the time made a compromise to look into the possible ban of legally held handguns, a move parents felt was a step in the right direction.
I can always remember the meeting with John Major. It was explained then that the best they could hope for in that political climate was a compromise where bans would be on a certain limit, the size of the gun.
Ladies and gentlemen.
As further pressure was placed on the government to turn this compromise into a reality, Lord Cullen also made 28 strong recommendations following his inquiry into the massacre, some of which focused on vital changes to police procedures.
I think a lot of the press called the police into question, and there was a lot of locals. By that time, the people had organised themselves into a group for justice for these kids. So there was a lot of political kind of aggravation going on at that time. And the police went, they were called to question. We'll never ever know the truth of this.
He had an history in the central region of Scotland. Whether anything could have been done about it, I don't know. He had been banned from certain venues. He had been banned from the schools in Dunblane of running clubs, so steps had been taken. He'd been reported to the police. They'd taken no action previously. Looking back, I wished obviously somebody had stepped in a lot earlier and prevented this person from doing what he did on the day.
Of the 28 recommendations put forward, the inquiry suggested more communication between police forces and more powers to question those holding a gun licence.
One area that was of particular concern to us only in retrospect was the involvement of the police, both in the licensing of Thomas Hamilton's firearms and also in their conduct on the day. I sat through a lot of evidence at the Cullen inquiry. I learnt a lot of things, most of which I don't think I'd have ever wanted to know about firearms legislation. And nothing I heard convinced me that it was safe for most people to have ownership of something as dangerous as handguns. That's not to say that any individual person would not be okay with them. It's just that the risk of having so many of these weapons in the hands of so many people was just not worth it.
14 months after the Dunblane massacre, a change in legislation was finally introduced.
The first Firearms Amendment Act, which banned the larger caliber handguns, came in about a year after the Dumblane shootings. The second act, which banned the smaller caliber handguns, became law later on in 1997. So that's 18 months or so from the awful events at Dumblane to getting a ban on the private ownership of handguns.
They just showed people how you can recover and you can make changes to the law for other people. And I just thought that they showed tremendous courage, the people who were behind that campaign.
Britain's been a safer place since the handgun ban has been in. And it was a ban on legally held weapons, not illegally held weapons. That was always the argument. Oh, what about the illegal weapons? And, well, they are illegal, so there are laws for that.
It's quite clear that in recent years, gun crime has been falling steadily. the risk of them happening has been considerably reduced.
The change in law was a significant milestone. But despite this, parents were left to form their own conclusions about Hamilton's motives.
Any attempt to explain what was going on in Thomas Hamilton's mind can only be a guess. Some good guessing perhaps went on at the inquiry by clinical psychiatrists, clinical psychologists. He had financial problems. He didn't like what he felt was being said about him in Dunblane and elsewhere. He didn't like the fact that his boys' club had been far less successful. And it's clear from other things he had said over the years that he was someone who liked to blame others for his failures.
Hamilton clearly had issues. The inquiry revealed that a week before the tragedy, he had written a letter to the Queen complaining he'd been branded a pervert and protesting his innocence.
Why Dumblane Primary School? Why that day? No one's ever going to know. It does, in a way, fit a pattern of mass killing. Someone who wants to kill themselves is aggrieved at how they feel other people have treated them, and so make sure that other people suffer at the same time as they kill themselves. But again, that's speculating on exactly why he wanted to do it.
Was it a revenge attack? You know, were we chosen against all the other towns that he'd had clubs in? And we'll never really know, I'd say, because he took his own life. He took a coward's way out. But in some respects, I think that's better for us, because I don't know how I'd react if he was still alive in a prison.
The horrific events of March the 13th, 1996, will be etched into people's minds forever. No one will ever know the full reason why 16 innocent children and their teacher were brutally murdered. Shortly after the new legislation was passed, Mick North decided to leave Dumblane.
I had to retire a year or so afterwards because my health wasn't good enough to continue working. I had no reason to stay in Dumblane after it happened, and since I had the option of moving away, I did.
As Mick North left Dumblane, Martin Dunn and his family decided to return.
We'd been back in England for a while. Myself and Barbara had been coming backwards and forwards to Scotland, so we could go to the cemetery every now and then. We decided that being away in England was not working for us, so eventually we made plans and we came back to Scotland. We've been here ever since, and for us that was the right decision.
The community of Dumblane has tried hard to move on from the tragedy. Shortly after the mass murder, the gymnasium at the primary school was demolished. But for those who witnessed the horrors of that day, nothing will erase the painful memories.
Life had changed for all these other children as well, because children who have witnessed something, who have got that as a memory. I mean, no child should have to see that, and they have that as a memory. If you ask someone to talk about their childhood, these children have that as a memory, that day and that week and those kids that they lost.
Go on, past Debbie. Go on, carry on.
The loss doesn't go away. As the years go on, it becomes a little bit more acceptable, but the raw pain on some days just doesn't go away. You drive past the school and see children running around in the playground and you think, oh, that could have been Charlotte. We couldn't go to a wedding for a long, long time because I hadn't got a daughter to give away anymore.
There's always a huge hole there, and you know, that's never ever going to go away, no matter what I do.
We'd have loved her whichever way she would have turned out, but we'll never know. There are those memories and reminders there that trigger those what-ifs.
It would be very hard to say exactly how much I miss Sophie. I can think of so many wonderful things that we could have done over the years.
Get upset We have good memories. We remember things that we did as a family. Sledging down the hill with a granddad. Over the years, we've come to learn to cope with those bad days, and the good days are there to remind us of the good times. Yeah.
I don't know how well I would have dealt with a teenage girl on my own. However, I would have loved the chance to find out.
It was the savage killing of a young man in broad daylight on a busy stretch of motorway, witnessed by his terrified fiancée. The killer, a high-ranking career criminal who had killed before. A stunned nation was gripped by the horrific road rage murder of Stephen Cameron as it made headline news. This was a crime that shook Britain. "21-year-old electrician Stephen Cameron was in the prime of his life. But on the 19th of May 1996, a lethal confrontation on a busy M25 motorway slip road would cost him his life.
Police are describing the attack as a case of road rage. They're appealing for witnesses to the murder, which happened earlier this afternoon on a slip road between the A20 and the M25 near Swanley in Kent.
Kent police launched a huge investigation, sparking an international manhunt to bring Stephen's killer to justice. This is the story of the brutal murder of Stephen Cameron, told from the inside through the eyewitness accounts of the family and the detective at the heart of the case. "21-year-old Stephen Cameron worked as an electrician. He was fun-loving and had a winning personality.
He was always teasing everybody. He was a very touchy-feely person. He had a way of coming up behind people and putting his arms around them and cuddling them. He always showed plenty of love.
My Stephen had a fabulous personality. His attitude to life was absolutely fantastic. He was kind, generous, funny. He was my best friend.
He was full of life, great fun to be with, just happy-go-lucky.
Stephen was in a long-term relationship with his childhood sweetheart, 17-year-old Danielle Cable. They lived together with Stephen's devoted parents, Ken and Tony, in Swanley, Kent.
Stephen met Danielle when she was at a bus stop, and this is her words to me. He looked at me, smiled at me, and I fell in love with him. And we all had our own lives, but we all were a very close family. We used to see each other all the time and do things together, go away together. We just had a perfect life. You just take it all for granted. It just seemed to us a normal, happy family life.
Stephen and myself, we used to go to golf, go and play pool. Where I worked, that's where Stephen done his training, and I used to see him every day, all day. He was always coming around, Dad, you haven't got £5 of it, I'm going to go and have some lunch. He used to tease the life out of me. We was really, really close.
In December 1995, Stephen had planned a memorable Christmas.
Christmas Eve, he came home and he'd bought her a ring. He just showed it to me and I said, oh dear, she doesn't even know. And he went over and see her mum and dad that evening and they were happy about it. So it was a really lovely Christmas that we spent together. They were looking forward to getting married later on and just having a happy family life together.
Stephen and Danielle were making plans for their future.
He was starting his own business with his cousin. They were starting up an electrical business together. Him and Danielle and his best friend Darren were moving in together. They'd rented a house in Chislehurst and they had everything to look forward to. He had his life ahead of him and he was so happy.
But this happy family life would soon be shattered. Deep in the heart of the Kent countryside, just 10 miles from the Cameron family home, lived one of Britain's most notorious criminals, Kenneth James Noye. Kenny Noye was already well known to the British police and public, a notorious career criminal involved in the money laundering of the Brinks Mat stolen gold, the largest bullion robbery in British criminal history.
We knew he was a criminal. We didn't know him. We knew there was a book that had been written, The Brinks Mat Robbery, which my husband had read and Stephen also had read.
In November 1983, a highly organised South London gang of 6 armed robbers slipped into a maximum security warehouse near Heathrow and stole 3 tons of gold bullion worth a staggering £26 million. It was during the hunt for the missing gold that Kenny Noye was brought to the attention of the police. He was turning the gold into cash. But during the Brinks Mat investigation, he murdered undercover surveillance officer, Detective Constable John Fordham, in a frenzied knife attack, stabbing the officer multiple times in his chest. Sensationally acquitted on the grounds of self-defence, Noye was instead sentenced to 14 years in prison for his involvement in the conspiracy to handle stolen gold and VAT fraud. He was released early, 7 years later, in 1994.
Kenneth Noye hadn't long been out of prison. I was unashamed in the way in which he went about his life. He didn't have much shame about the fact that he'd got 14 years in prison for handling stolen goods, the gold from the Brinks Mat.
But Noye was once again about to make headline news. It was a seemingly normal Sunday morning at the Cameron family home.
Because they'd been out the night before and Stephen had been drinking.
I control myself.
That morning, I had my 2 little granddaughters staying. They'd got in bed with Stephen and Danielle and was laughing and joking, and he told them that he was going to have them as his bridesmaids, and he was describing to them what sort of dresses they would have. I was up early because my mother, who lived across the road to us, wasn't very well, and she was in bed and I was going to go shopping. Stephen got up and he said, you're going to cook my breakfast, jokingly, and I said no. I said, I'm off out. And he said, oh, come on, Mum, please do my breakfast. I said, no, don't be so lazy, you do it. The last thing that he did was tell me he loved me. I left with the 2 granddaughters and took them shopping.
Yeah, we had a cup of coffee together, had a little chat, because he'd been out on the Saturday night to a club.
You got to be ready in 5?
Yeah.
As Stephen and Danielle got ready, they discussed their plans for the day.
Stephen was going up to London to buy some bagels for all his friends. They were all going to a football match that afternoon to watch Danielle's brother play football.
Stephen suggested to Danielle that she drive the Bedford van.
I'm going to drive.
You'll be all right.
Danielle was driving because they'd been out the night before and Stephen had been drinking.
Danielle, never driven on a motorway in her life. She'd only just passed her test. Stephen decides that, Danielle, you can drive the vehicle, we'll go out and get some shopping. She was very reluctant to do that, but accepted that perhaps to please him she would drive it and get a motorway driving out of the way, as it were, but she wasn't very happy about it, especially a van.
I was on a Sunday, it was about 1:10. I was watching the Monaco Grand Prix. Just started the warm-up lap, and Stephen went off with Danielle.
As they set off from their home to drive to London, they were unaware of the danger ahead of them. Sunday, 19th of May, 1996. Stephen Cameron and his fiancée Danielle Cable were planning to meet friends. Having been out drinking the night before, Stephen suggested that Danielle should drive his van. A reluctant Danielle agreed, and they set off from their home in Kent to travel to London on the M25.
Stephen was on the phone to his best friend, Darren, who he'd known since he was about 4.5, and they were going to share the house together that week they were moving in.
They drove down Beechenley Lane, where they lived, and turned left onto London Road, heading towards the Swanley interchange and the M25 motorway.
So she drives onto the motorway at the Swanley interchange. We think she cut somebody up or had taken someone's road. The Land Rover Discovery pulled across the front of the vehicle when they stopped at the traffic lights just prior to joining the motorway.
Outraged by this late lane change, the motorist stormed out of his Land Rover and approached the van. Stephen and Danielle had never seen him before. It was convicted criminal Kenneth Noye.
Danielle is in a dreadful state at the driver's wheel of this rascal van.
Terrified, Danielle had no idea why her driving had just triggered such a tirade of abuse from the other motorist. Stephen stepped out of the van and approached the raging driver.
Stephen wasn't even driving. He was just protecting his fiancée, which any man would do.
Stephen Cameron came face to face with Kenneth Noye.
What he didn't know at the time, of course, was that the one person that he picked this gesticulation with was Kenneth Noye, a known criminal.
They quickly became embroiled in a heated exchange of words.
There is a confrontation between Stephen and Kenneth Noye at the front of the rascal van, of which Danielle saw the lot.
But the disagreement soon turned to physical violence.
The first punch would appear to have been thrown by Kenneth Noye.
Stephen instinctively defended himself.
But whatever happened, Kenneth Noye was getting the worst of the confrontation that effectively he'd chosen to have.
In a desperate bid to help her fiancé, Danielle frantically tried flagging down other motorists. Over 30 vehicles passed, but no one stopped to help. But it soon appeared that a younger, bigger and stronger Stephen had managed to defeat Noye.
Instead of leaving, instead of just going, he goes back to his vehicle, to the passenger side, and comes back as Stephen's coming back into the rascal van with what we now know is a knife. Danielle is screaming at Stephen, he's got a knife, Steve.
Stephen turned away to walk away, and the man went back and got a knife.
And the next thing you know, he's stabbed by Kenneth Noye, fatally in the heart.
Noye twice plunged the knife into Stephen's body, puncturing his heart and liver. With the knife still in his hand, Kenneth Noye got back into his vehicle and drove off at speed. Stephen had collapsed in Danielle's arms, covered in blood.
The only person who had the presence of mind to think about getting the registration number of the Land Rover Discovery was indeed Stephen.
With Stephen dying in her arms, A distressed Danielle phoned for an ambulance and then quickly called Ken Cameron.
When Danielle phoned me, I just went into total panic mode.
Stay calm. Stay there.
I don't even remember driving to the roundabout. Yeah, I just got in the car and went. I just got there and I see Danielle and she was as white as a sheet. She was really, really white, pale, and she was shaking like a leaf. So I sat her in the car and I went over to Stephen and, yeah.
Within minutes, paramedics arrived on the scene, but they were too late.
I just looked at him and just knew he was dead. He was as white as anything and I just knew he was dead. They knew he was dead. That's an image that's actually burnt into my head. I can still see him laying there. I was numb. My body just felt totally numb. If anyone had said to me, if you were to see your son lying in the road and you knew he was dead, how would you react? I'd have said I'd have gone hysterical. I was as calm as anything. I suppose something just takes over, doesn't it? The adrenaline just takes over.
What's his name? Stephen. Stephen.
Ken drove back home to tell Tony.
Just as I'd got home, he rushed out the house and said to me, just get in the car. And I see Danielle was sitting in the front, so I got in the back with the two girls, not knowing what it was. And I always remember looking at Danielle and she was staring straight ahead. Her face was as white as snow. And I knew by my husband's panic that something was wrong. And I remember my husband was driving frantically and he said to me, Stephen's been stabbed. I just felt my heart was going to come out of my chest. It was just thumping and thumping. And I just couldn't understand, you know, what was going on. I remember phoning my son. I was panicking and I thought, I've got to phone the two little girls' mum to tell them to meet us at the hospital because I didn't want them to be there.
Danielle just sat there as quiet as anything. He never said a word.
We went into a small room and we all stood there just waiting for news.
I knew Stephen was dead, but I couldn't tell her. I just couldn't tell her.
The doctor came in and he told us that they couldn't save our Stephen. He'd died. I couldn't speak, I couldn't do anything. I just remember feeling numb. Everything was so normal that morning and something like that just didn't seem real. And I couldn't believe that my Stephen could have died. I just wanted to be with him and they did allow us to go and see him. And I remember holding his hand and, you know, I don't know how I felt. I just felt numb. I still can't believe that it was him laying there. I can't think how my husband must have felt because he actually saw him. I was spared that, but I wish I'd have been with him though, because it'd be nice as a mother to be with him at that time.
The one thing I always stuck in my mind, I can never remember seeing any blood. I can never remember seeing any blood at all. And he must have been covered in blood, quite truthful. Don't remember, it must blanked out.
When your child leaves the house, you wave them goodbye, but you never think you're not going to see them again.
A man's been stabbed to death after an argument with another driver. Police are describing the
One-year-old
attack
Stephen
as a case
Cameron
of
from
road
Swanley was killed in front of his girlfriend during an argument on a motorway slip road.
Danielle, whose surname isn't being released by the police, had been engaged to Stephen for 6 months.
The shocking headlines the following day horrified the nation. There was stunned disbelief that a motorist could kill another over an argument about their driving. Kent police quickly mounted Operation Quern to hunt down Stephen's killer.
It was one of the biggest criminal investigations in terms of resources for the Kent police that we've ever had. We had something like in excess of 30 witnesses who had been using the motorway, that junction, at the time, and each of them saw different parts of what happened. Danielle, of course, saw everything that happened.
He was driving a Land Rover when I came up.
Out of all the witnesses that we had that saw, if not all the incident, but part of the incident, none of them got the whole registration number. None of them.
With no vehicle registration number, Kent police were struggling to identify the killer. Had Kenneth Noye managed to get away with the stabbing? Electrician Stephen Cameron was in the prime of his life until he was fatally stabbed during a road rage incident on a busy motorway slip road. His dying words to his fiancée were to note down his killer's number plate. Kenneth Noye, a notorious criminal, had fled the crime scene.
There was someone out there that stabbed Stephen and I wanted them caught.
Although we had witnesses who could say what happened, nobody identified the person, no one knew who he was, and we were in a very difficult position because we didn't have any forensic evidence that would link a suspect to the scene. There is a CCTV camera at that junction, and on that particular day, the 19th of May, it was not working.
With no forensic evidence and no CCTV, Kent police were struggling to identify the M25 killer.
The man disappeared in what we knew was an L-registered Land Rover Discovery. Difficulty you had was, of course, we didn't have the entire registration number. The police national computer showed 18,000 plus L-registered Land Rover Discoveries, and they're only the legitimate ones that were registered in the UK. But when you spoke to the witnesses, we had about 5 different colours. The colours ranged from green to maroon to blue to grey to black. Very soon we realised that we were going to find it very difficult to find that particular vehicle. If you don't have that significant lead for a named person within the first 48, 72 hours, you know it's going to be an uphill task.
Two months after he was stabbed, the funeral of Stephen Cameron took place at St Mary's Church in Swanley. Friends and family gathered to pay their respects and say their final goodbye.
We had a house full of people and we both felt lonely. Well, you just try and keep yourself going, trying to be strong. I was trying to be strong for Tony. Tony was trying to be strong for us, for me. But you just go through the motions of life, don't you?
At the time, you're numb. I was doing things, don't remember what I was doing. It was as though I was standing up on the ceiling looking down at everybody.
After Stephen died, I tried to get on with my life the best I could. It was very, very difficult. I just couldn't work anymore. I needed a nervous breakdown. I just couldn't face going to work. I couldn't cope with work. If it hadn't been for Tony, I don't know what I would have done, because she was an absolute brick.
The grieving family's focus turned once more to the police investigation and finding the M25 killer.
There was lots of points where you think that he isn't going to get caught, he isn't going to get found. And that was the worst part, not knowing where he was. We wanted him caught. For Stephen's sake, we would have gone to the ends of the world for that to happen.
I did start to question if they would actually catch him in my own mind. I used to phone up Nick Biddis, the superintendent, and beat him up every week on the phone. I used to give him a hard time.
There is always a pressure for us to solve such dreadful crimes. There's pressures both from the police, as it were, the public, the media, and especially the family. I mean, Danielle's lost a fiancé. Ken and Tony, of course, they've lost a son.
A heartbroken Danielle was their key witness, and Kent police desperately needed her to help solve the murder.
And what did Stephen do?
Danielle was extremely cooperative and wanted justice for Stephen and the family. She was always available for me to interview her or to get some information if there was anything, and I always kept regular contact with her, with Ken and Tony Cameron.
So when the man hit him, that must have just made him really angry.
Danielle's emotions gave me the strength because I knew I had to help her. It was a sort of a motherly instinct, if you like, and I felt I had to be strong for her.
He was just trying to defuse.
To see someone you love stabbed to death and die in your arms, especially because she was so young and she was so hurt by it all.
Danielle provided the police with a description of the vehicle and Stephen's killer, whilst intelligence was beginning to shed some light on the identity of the Land Rover owner.
There was information that came in relation to local criminals, which is not unusual in a murder inquiry. Kenneth Noye was the sort of guy that wouldn't hide away and would be part of his local community, be seen. It was suggested to us that he disappeared.
This key piece of intelligence shocked those involved.
I couldn't imagine anyone that would have gone back and got a knife, so I obviously thought it was some sort of villain to do something like that and to do it and run and not show any remorse. It might be road rage, but to me it was murder.
We were extremely surprised to think that somebody of Kenneth Noye's professional criminal standard would get involved in such a crime. But of course he's disappeared, so we need to look at it.
We never for a moment imagined that he would have been there to have murdered Stephen. It was 1,000,000 to 1 chance that he would meet such a criminal.
I didn't believe it. First off, I just could not believe it. A person with his stature in the criminal world at 1:20 of a Sunday afternoon would do such a stupid thing in broad daylight in front of loads of people. Because he's a person who's well known in the area. I just didn't believe it.
But Kenny Noye had realised the enormity of his crime. After stabbing Stephen Cameron to death, Kenneth Noye raced back to his home, where he made a number of frantic calls, packed a suitcase with cash and left.
Within 24 hours of the murder, his phone went dead. His mobile phone went dead. And of course, we had no means of finding out what communication he may have been using. Clearly he was using something, but we didn't have any way of monitoring it. We obviously searched his house. His associates and friends and his family claimed they hadn't seen him or he'd gone. I don't know where he was. but he'd had nothing to do with such a crime. Nobody would tell us anything, nobody knew anything. Hear no evil, speak no evil, see no evil. He just disappeared off the face of the earth.
With the help of his underworld contacts, Noye was whisked across the channel by helicopter, fleeing the country.
We knew he had a criminal background. He had friends in the criminal world that would help him to stay away, and we knew he would have all these things to help him.
He was desperate to cover his tracks and raise as little suspicion as possible.
We then soon realised that Kenneth Noye not only had disappeared, but the Land Rover Discovery that he had been driving has disappeared. There was another, what we called a doppelganger vehicle, had been stuck on his driveway. This vehicle, which looked exactly the same colour and type of the one that we were looking for, was bought for cash. And that vehicle landed up on Kenneth Noye's driveway. I think it was put there so as if anybody was casually passing by to say that, you know, Kenneth Noye's disappeared, but his vehicle's still on his driveway.
Very quickly, the press discovered the identity of the prime suspect and took a renewed interest in the story.
The press found out that we were looking to try and find Kenneth Noye, who was well known in media circles, and therefore it was a good story. Sells papers.
You guys, I'm going to put you in charge of dealing with all the witnesses. Your work is mine.
I think the police knew or thought it was Kenneth Noye for about 2 weeks after Stephen died. And they were just looking for him. But I don't think they wanted it broadcast.
I didn't really want his name mentioned at all, because I knew that it could potentially harm any fair trial. No matter who the defendant is, they're entitled to a fair trial. And the next thing you know, it's on the Sunday papers, pictures, everything. Kent Police are after Kenneth Noye in relation to the M25 murders. Does anybody know where he is?
I found out Noye was the chief suspect when I bought the News of the World one Sunday morning, in which they was totally outrageous. They shouldn't have done that.
I suppose what I could say was it could have been as a result of the public knowing that, of course, made people aware and kept it in the minds of the public, kept the story and the case going.
The story was generating huge amounts of interest. Reported sightings of Noye started coming in.
We had sightings of Kenneth Noye, people who thought they'd seen Kenneth Noye, from all over the world. We went from Russia to Brazil, he'd gone to South America to have his face changed. Kenneth Noye is dead, definitely dead. I said, unless I see his dead body and I have his fingerprints off it, I won't believe it. But there were sightings all over the place. I'm surprised he wasn't seen on the moon.
2 years into the murder investigation, Kent Police finally got a major breakthrough. They received reports that Noye was residing in Spain.
Noye kept a very low profile and, of course, changed his identity with a new passport in the name of Green. His lifestyle was one where he was living in a very remote house. He would be drinking in bars. He was keeping himself to himself, but clearly wasn't a hermit.
The police needed to confirm that the sightings were indeed that of Kenneth James Noye. But media intrusion into the investigation was making things difficult.
The problem I had was the minute I sent any officers abroad, it would only be 24, most 48 hours before the press found out. Eventually, I ran it as a secret inquiry. I sent the officers out there with the remit, all I need you to do is to go out there and see if you can see this guy and tell me whether it's Kenneth Noye. Don't forget that in 1984, Kenneth Noye had killed a police officer in the grounds of his house at West Kingsdown, and I've sent 2 officers out with absolutely no backup to a foreign country to see if they can find this man and identify him.
With their mission outlined, the undercover surveillance officers tracked Noye down to a bar.
Those officers actually knew Kenneth Noye because of obviously his previous convictions, and they gave me a positive response. It's definitely him.
It was a big major breakthrough, but it was sort of opening wounds up because 2 years on we were, you know, settling down a little bit.
But bringing Kenneth Noye to justice was by no means a straightforward feat.
We still hadn't got either any forensic evidence or anybody actually identifying Kenneth Noye as the person who stabbed Stephen Cameron. But the bottom line was that in order to link him with the crime on the 19th of May, I needed Danielle to identify him.
She actually was the only one that actually looked him in the eyes and saw him that day.
It was now up to Danielle to bring Stephen's killer to justice. But 2 years after the stabbing, would Danielle be able to positively identify her fiancé's killer? After fatally stabbing Stephen Cameron on a busy motorway slip road, notorious criminal Kenneth Noye fled the country. It sparked an international manhunt to bring him to justice. Having finally located Noye in Spain, Kent police now needed to positively identify him as Stephen's killer. There was only one person who was capable of doing that, the only person who witnessed the entire murder, Stephen's fiancée, Danielle Cable.
The identification out in Spain was, in my view, the most significant point of the whole investigation. Clearly, if she didn't identify the person out there, who we knew was Kenneth Noye, as the person who had killed her fiancé, Stephen Cameron, then the whole case in terms of Kenneth Noye would have fallen apart. And I kept regular contact with Danielle, told her that at some stage, Danielle, it may be that you have to go somewhere outside this country and you may have to try and identify the person responsible.
When the police came round to see us and inform us that Danielle had actually been taken away on a plane to identify the suspect, it came as a shock because we had no idea that they were that close to catching him.
He didn't tell us where. He just said Danielle was on the plane. As I speak to you at the moment, we think we found him. I was elated. Cried my eyes out.
Oh, I was really concerned. I was really worried about her because I knew she would be upset. I knew she'd be frightened.
Of course, there were dangers in doing that. There were dangers for her welfare, so much so that when we eventually decided that she'd have to go out there to do this, I decided to do it in as public an area as possible. What we were trying to avoid was, if you like, a one-to-one situation. Fortunately for us, we went out to a restaurant where it was absolutely packed. Danielle was able to look through a window. And she was positive in her identification.
Nick Bidis phoned us and said, "We've got him, she's ID'd him, it's him." And we were just, you know, so relieved.
It's about 2 years after Stephen died, which was an eternity, but they actually found him.
We were then able, as a result of that identification, to obtain a warrant for his arrest in the UK.
Within 24 hours, Kent police were granted a warrant for Kenny Noye's arrest.
Kenneth Noye was a creature of habit, and he was a person who frequented much the same bars in the Barbat area. And he was located in a particular bar where he was sitting outside on the seafront, and he was accompanied by a young lady. The Spanish authorities were actually fully briefed as to Kenneth Noye's previous convictions and his previous history as regards his violence towards officers. And they, I can assure you, took no chances when it came to arresting him. He was very quickly grabbed, immobilised, handcuffed and taken into custody.
With Noye arrested, the process for his extradition back to the UK began, a lengthy process that would take a year to complete.
It was for the British courts to decide whether it was being dealt with in accordance with the law, and they granted it, and he was duly extradited 3 years almost to the day that the crime had been committed. Initially, he claimed he had nothing to do whatsoever with the incident on the M25 on the 19th of May and knew nothing about the murder of Stephen Cameron, and that the British police were after him because of him being acquitted of murder of a police officer. That was his claim.
That is the problem. That is the problem with everything that happened last time.
Once he was brought back to the country, he then accepted that it was indeed him that had killed Stephen Cameron on the 19th of May, but that it was in self-defence.
The guy actually attacked me. That's what you've got to understand. He attacked me.
He had to hold his hands up. Yes, I was there, it was me, but it was self-defence. It was never self-defence. Stephen wasn't carrying a knife, he was one carrying a knife.
"4 years after killing Stephen Cameron, Kenneth Noye stood trial at the Old Bailey. He pleaded not guilty.
It's very important to go to the trial and see him face the music and see justice done.
The first time I saw Kenneth Noye in court, I wanted him to be dead for killing my son.
Stabbing him twice, he intended to kill him, and I just wanted justice for Stephen. That's all I've ever wanted.
When he gave evidence at court, he said that he believed he had to leave the scene, leave the country, because the police would make sure that he got convicted of a crime he never committed, and therefore he wasn't going to hang around and wait to be arrested.
He was trying to make out that Stephen was the violent person, that it was in self-defence. He even said in court that he thought Stephen was going to throw him over the bridge and all sorts of silly things he came out with.
He was a maniac, he was a psychopath. What could I do?
But it was Danielle's witness statement that would be of crucial importance.
The key part to this case, and the one that linked it all together, was the identification of Kenneth Noye by Danielle Cable. Forensically, there was nothing there, and unless we had somebody who could identify the person who stuck the knife into Stephen, then we would never have got a conviction.
Part of his defence was that he had been identified unlawfully by Danielle. It was proven that it wasn't. Danielle was a key witness, and the one thing she always said was that his eyes, evil eyes, and that's what she see when she went out to Spain and see him, his evil eyes. That's when she knew it was him.
I hereby sentence you to life imprisonment.
Kenneth Noye was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Stephen Cameron. He would have to serve a minimum term of 16 years before he could be considered for parole.
At the time, I felt elated that he'd been found guilty, but I felt deflated that life didn't mean life, because he got 16 years. To me, he should never come out. He doesn't deserve to be out. He showed no remorse. I feel that Stephen got justice because we caught the person that did it, but I don't feel that there's justice, the fact that he's going to one day walk free and have some sort of life.
Me personally, I think the law now should be that anyone who carries a knife, is caught carrying a knife, should be put in prison. It's treated totally different to gun crimes, which I think people die with knives and people die with guns. Why is it treated totally different to gun crimes?
I don't know where she is now. I don't know what her identity is, and neither do I need to know. All I want to make sure is that she can get on and lead the rest of her life in a happy way and a content way.
We haven't seen Danielle since 1998, and we absolutely loved Danielle. She was a wonderful little girl. She really was a wonderful little girl, and we both miss her.
She was a very brave girl to have done what she did, because she could have easily turned around and said, I'm sorry, but I'm not going to get involved in it because it's likely to be a problem. But I think she's a very brave girl and should be given all credit for that.
Stephen would have been a fantastic father, absolutely fantastic father. We'd have had fantastic grandchildren with him, which we've been totally denied by an evil man.
You live your life, but you're not happy. Inside, your heart's broken. No one can mend that.
Our son Michael can't even talk about Stephen. He can't face that his brother's dead. You know, but yeah, everyone's got on with their life, which, you know, we've had to go on with their life. You have to, don't you? Life goes on. But you don't stop mourning, you don't stop missing Stephen. I miss him every day, all day.